Okay, welcome back to Old Testament Children of the East, Part 4. Now, for those of you that are following along with the Bible, you can look at Exodus chapter 2, maybe just take some notes. I'm just kind of going to give a little bit of dialogue about these stories that most of you are probably familiar with. In Exodus chapter 2, Moses flees to a place called Midian. Now, it's interesting to me that this is where Moses would be led, but he is, after all, a prince in the land of Egypt. Midian is a far country, a good place to hide if you are fleeing persecution, and the Bible records this is where Moses fled from Pharaoh after killing an Egyptian and hiding him in the desert. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses has come out of Egypt after becoming the great leader of God's people, after having, through God's providence, performed great miracles and even predicting incredible plagues that God had poured out on the Pharaoh and the Egyptian people for the sake of the deliverance of Israel. Moses has now come out of Egypt with the children of Israel and has moved into the land of Midian. And there at the foot of Sinai, Moses is met by the priest of Midian. Now, this is his father-in-law. His name would be Jethro, and Jethro, the Bible records, is the priest of Midian. He meets Moses at the foot of Sinai and is reunited, brings Moses' wife and his children where they are reunited there at the foot of Sinai. And Moses begins to tell his father-in-law the wonderful story of the great deliverance that had been wrought by God, how they crossed the Red Sea, and how God had performed many mighty miracles for the sake of His people. Now, in chapter 18, verse 12, something very interesting happens. After hearing this story, Jethro is moved upon in his heart to give praise to God. He sacrifices a sacrifice to God. He says there is only one God, and God is surely the one true God. There is no other gods but He. This is an interesting dialogue that you hear coming from the mouth of Jethro in chapter 18 of the book of Exodus, because it's a very Eastern perspective on who God is and what God is. And it says that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came, and all the elders of Israel came to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Now, the reason why I have this particular scripture on the screen for you this morning is because there's a principle that I believe is embedded in this verse that is very important in regard to building relationships with Muslim people. In my experience working and living with Muslims, I have discovered that sitting around a dinner table, breaking bread together, having meaningful conversations, letting your children play with theirs, that bridges can be built between Christianity and Islam if we would simply love each other enough to spend time with one another, to have a meal, to break bread with one another, to worship God together, and to witness our faith in a very practical way by living in someone's presence with the character that God has given you. Okay? This is a very important principle. I was excited when I discovered it in the Scripture. When I read this for the first time, my mind immediately went back to multiple instances where wonderful friendships and relationships were cemented around a table during the course of breaking bread or having a meal together. You'll notice this red dot on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula represents the area known as Midian in biblical times. This is where God led Moses. This is where He gave him His holy law on the Mount of Sinai. This is where He instructed him in preparation for being a leader of the children of Israel. Interesting that it wasn't Jerusalem or some other place that's held in great esteem in Scripture. It was Midian, I believe, because in Midian there were a group of people, descendants of Abraham's son Ishmael, that were keeping the religion of God. They continued to reverence Him as the one and only true God, and because of this, God felt very comfortable sending Moses to live in Midian with what would later become his father-in-law Jethro. Numbers chapter 13, there is an interesting story where a man named Caleb is asked to represent the tribe of Judah nonetheless, and was sent into the promised land to spy out the land and to see if it would be good to inhabit by the children of Israel. In the same book, in chapter 32, Caleb is promised entrance into this land. Most of the children of Israel had not been obedient to God's instruction, so that they were told they would die in the wilderness. Caleb was promised entrance, and in Genesis chapter 15, we recognize that Caleb was the descendant of a people known as Kenizzites. His father, the Bible records, was a Kenizzite, which is a descendant of the mixed amalgamated children of the East. This is interesting. So Caleb, technically, at least with one side of his family from his father's heritage, was not originally of the tribe of Judah or even an Israelite at all. Matthew Henry's commentary describes the possibility of the Kenizzite Jephunneh, the father of Caleb, possibly marrying into the tribe of Judah, settling in their lands, and according to the promise or the instruction given to Moses, if you did this, if you were circumcised, if you became part and lived among the children of Israel, you would become an Israelite by virtue of marriage, by virtue of keeping the commandments, becoming circumcised, and living with a particular tribe. You would actually be grafted in and become part of that tribe. This is the case for Caleb, a very Arab name, by the way. His father Jephunneh was grafted into the tribe of Judah, so Caleb's mother would have probably been an Israelite, while his father, a Kenizzite, was a descendant of the children of the East. Judges chapter 6, verses 1 through 6. An interesting story in the Old Testament says, "And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord delivered them into the hands of Midian for 7 years." Here we have Midian being mentioned again, or the people, descendants of Midian in the region where they lived. Because of Israel's disobedience to God, they were subjected to a 7-year bondage by the Midianites. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them dens, which are in the mountains, and caves, and strongholds. So the Midianites were pretty fierce. Children of Israel were forced to live in caves to flee from this enemy. And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, and the children of the East. Now here, the phrase children of the East is used for the first time in Old Testament, referring or referencing the descendants of Midian, the amalgamated people of the East. Even they came up against them, and they encamped against them, and destroyed the increase of the earth till they came unto Gaza, and left no substance for Israel, neither sheep nor ox nor ass. Notice in verses 5 and 6, they came up with their cattle, the Midianites, their tents, and they came as grasshoppers for a multitude. For both they and their camels were without number, and they had entered into the land to destroy it. and Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Now, in the Peshitta translation, which is a translation from the Aramaic, the Peshitta Bible is used by the Orthodox Church in the East. It's the only one that's accepted. They don't put a lot of stock in Greek or in Latin, so Aramaic is their language of choice. In the Peshitta translation, instead of the word grasshoppers, the word locust is used. Now, in the original language, locust or grasshopper could be used interchangeably. Why is this important? We will find out as we move into the New Testament and look at some prophecies where the children of the East are once again likened to locust. In Egypt, when the plagues were being poured out against the Pharaoh, the locust originated from the east. It says they were brought in by an eastern wind. So locusts have often been used in the form of a plague against apostasy, both in the Old Testament, and we'll notice later when we study some New Testament prophecies that these children of the East would also again be used in the same way and described with the same terminology. We also have the story of Ruth in the Old Testament. Ruth, the Moabitess, a child of the East, who, because of her great character, became grafted in to the children of Israel and actually became part of the lineage of Christ Himself. The Messiah was born through her lineage. So this is another example of the children of the East in the Old Testament and how God had a remarkable plan to use them. Jonah. Jonah is an interesting story. He went to a place called Nineveh. You may recognize Nineveh as being an eastern country as well. This is part of the land that was given to Ishmael or to the elder son. In the maps that we looked at earlier, this was not part of the land promised to the Israelites. This is outside the borders of that, so it would have been the inheritance of the other brother. And in the book of Jonah, we learned that these people repented of their sins and God spared them from destruction. Are there parallels, or can there be parallels to the same story today? Joel chapter 2, verse 25 also describes the chastisement of the Midianites. And I want you to notice how it describes the Midianite army that came out against Israel to persecute Israel, to reprimand Israel because of their apostasy. It says in Joel chapter 2, verse 25, "And I will restore you the years that the locust," once again, the word locust is used to describe this group of people, "that the locusts have eaten, the cankerworm, the caterpillar, and the palmer worm, my great army, which I sent among you." So God here describes this locust army, the Midianite army, as His great army, which was sent against Israel because of their apostasy. Now, I like the NIV translation in regard to this verse. It makes it very clear that locusts were being focused on here, that this particular creature was being used to signify the children of the East as they were being used as a plague against this apostasy. It reads a little bit differently than the King James. It says, "I will repay you the years the locusts have eaten, the great locust, the young locust, the other locusts, and the locust swarm." So they definitely emphasize the use of the word locust. Now, in our next series, we will look at how a locust army is used in New Testament prophecy and how God intends to continue to use the children of the East in the future in regard to their relationship with God's people and ultimately God's plan to redeem the world, to save those who are sincere to know Him. And we will look at some historic Adventist documents to learn more about these prophecies and God's intention for the children of the East in the future of this planet. Thank you. Join us again.